When I was 16, my parents went on a weekend trip and left me at my cousin Ryan's house. It wasn't the first time I stayed there, but it always felt strange. My house was strict, set bedtimes, family dinners, everything in order. Ryan's house was the opposite. His mom, Aunt Linda, worked late shifts at the hospital, and his dad, Uncle Greg, traveled constantly for work. It was just Ryan and me that weekend, free to do whatever we wanted. No rules, no structure. Most people my age would have loved it, but it made me uneasy. The first night we stayed up playing video games until almost 2 in the morning. When I finally dragged myself to bed, the guest room felt unfamiliar, colder than I remembered. The air smelled faintly of old books, like the ones lining the dusty shelves by the window. The bed was stiff, the blankets too thin. I stared at the ceiling for a while, listening to the distant hum of the fridge in the kitchen. It was too quiet. I wasn't used to quiet. At home, my dad always left a fan running in the hall. The silence in Ryan's house felt unnatural, like the house itself was holding its breath. At some point I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of heavy footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth in the hallway. I blinked groggily, my heart already pounding. It had to be Uncle Greg checking on me. He always treated me like a little kid, even though I was almost 6 feet tall. But then I remembered. Uncle Greg wasn't home. He was in Chicago for work. The only people in the house were me and Ryan had passed out hours ago, snoring loud enough to shake the walls. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, not moving, just standing there. My skin prickled. I wanted to call out, to ask if it was Ryan, but something stopped me. It was an instinct, the kind you don't question. Instead, I held my breath and waited. A long, heavy silence stretched between me and whatever was on the other side of that door. Then, 3 knocks, not loud, not hurried, just patient, deliberate. I clenched the blanket in my fists. I don't know why, but I knew deep in my gut that I shouldn't answer. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to stay still, to pretend I was asleep. Maybe whoever or whatever was out there would just go away. But then the doorknob rattled. Not violently, not like someone was trying to force their way in. It was slow, careful, almost testing. A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to believe it was Ryan messing with me, but that didn't make sense. He was a deep sleeper and I would have heard him get up. Besides, this wasn't the kind of prank he'd pull. He liked scaring people with jump scares and dumb horror movies. Not this. Not whatever this was. The knob stopped moving, and for a second, I thought it was over. Then the door creaked. Just a tiny sound, barely more than a whisper, but enough to send my heart slamming against my ribs. It hadn't opened, at least not yet, but the weight of something pressed against it, like someone was leaning in, listening. I could feel it. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker, like the pressure had shifted. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, my breathing shallow. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put, to not make a sound. Minutes passed, maybe more. My muscles ached from staying so still, but I didn't dare move. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the presence outside my door was gone. No retreating footsteps, no sounds of someone walking away. Just nothing. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 5 minutes, 10, 15. Still nothing. Slowly I let out a shaky breath. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I was just freaking myself out for no reason. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I forced myself to sit up, my ears straining for any sound. The house was dead silent. I reached for my phone on the nightstand and turned on the screen. 3:14 a.m. My mouth felt dry, my hands clammy. I needed to check. just to prove to myself that there was nothing there. Swinging my legs over the bed, I stood up, the floorboards cold against my bare feet. My pulse hammered as I reached for the door handle. Slowly, carefully, I turned it and pulled the door open. The hallway was empty. The dim glow from a street lamp outside barely lit the hallway, casting long, distorted shadows along the walls. Everything looked the same as it had when I went to bed, but something felt wrong. The air was colder, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I stepped out cautiously, my breath shallow, scanning the hallway. Ryan's door was shut. The bathroom door was open a crack, just as it had been earlier. Nothing was out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been here, watching, waiting. I took a few slow steps, listening for any sound, but the house was eerily still. I wanted to call out to Ryan, wake him up, but a small, irrational fear kept me from making a noise. What if I wasn't supposed to? What if acknowledging it made it worse? My eyes flicked toward the stairs leading down to the living room. A strange thought struck me. What if something was down there, just standing in the dark, listening? My skin crawled. I wasn't going to find out. Heart hammering, I backed into the guest room and shut the door, locking it this time. I climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets over me like they could shield me from whatever was out there. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, my thumb hovering over the screen, ready to call someone if I needed to. I must have lain there for an hour, staring at the ceiling, waiting for another sound, another knock, but nothing came. By morning, everything felt normal again. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, and the eerie silence of the night before was replaced by the distant hum of cars outside. At breakfast, I casually asked Ryan if he had been up during the night. He just frowned and shook his head. Dude, I was out cold. I didn't mention what happened. I didn't want to sound crazy. But before I left that afternoon, I asked Aunt Linda about the guest room. She hesitated. Oh, that used to be Greg's dad's room before he passed. He was always a night owl, pacing the halls when he couldn't sleep. She smiled like it was a fond memory, but all I could think about was the heavy footsteps outside my door, and the way they never walked away. I got home late that night, exhausted after another brutal shift at the warehouse. It was mid-October, the kind of night where the cold seeps into your bones, and all you want is a hot shower and a bed that doesn't judge you for passing out in your work clothes. I lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town, nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom with a creaky porch and a mailbox that leaned forward like it was tired of standing. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people kept to themselves. That's why, when I pulled into my driveway and saw my front door slightly open, my stomach dropped. I sat in the car for a second, staring at the dark gap between the door and the frame, trying to convince myself that I had just forgotten to lock up in my rush that morning. I stepped out, keys clenched in my hand like they'd somehow protect me. The porch light flickered as I moved toward the door, and I hesitated before pushing it open the rest of the way. My house was dark, the familiar shape of my couch barely visible in the dim glow of the street lamp outside. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no rustling. Just the quiet hum of my refrigerator. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Maybe the wind had caught the door, or maybe I had been so out of it this morning that I hadn't closed it all the way. Still, I reached over and flipped on the light. That's when I noticed the first thing out of place. My kitchen towel was missing. It wasn't a big deal on its own, but I always kept it hanging from the oven handle. Habit. Now the handle was bare. My brows knitted together as I stepped further in, scanning the room. The rest of the kitchen looked normal. The dishes I had left in the sink were still there, the cereal box on the counter still open from my rushed breakfast. But something felt off. A strange unease settled over me, like an itch at the back of my mind I couldn't scratch. Then I turned toward the hallway and my stomach twisted. My sneakers, the ones I had left neatly by the door, were now sitting a few inches to the left, just slightly out of place. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. Maybe I had nudged them without noticing, but deep down, I knew that wasn't it. My routine was second nature. Every morning I put on my work boots and leave my sneakers right by the door. I never moved them. My pulse picked up as I took another step inside. That's when I smelled it. Faint, but distinct. The sharp, lingering scent of cigarette smoke. I froze. I didn't smoke. No one had been in my house in weeks. And yet the smell was there, stale and heavy, like someone had been standing in my living room not too long ago. I stood there, barely breathing, my ears straining for any sound beyond the hum of the fridge. The smell of cigarette smoke wasn't fresh, but it was strong enough to make my skin crawl. I hadn't had any visitors. No one had a spare key. And yet, someone had been inside. My hands felt clammy as I reached for the nearest thing I could use as a weapon. A heavy flashlight I kept on the counter. I gripped it tight, my heart pounding as I forced myself to move deeper into the house. The hallway leading to my bedroom felt longer than usual, every shadow stretching and shifting under the dim light. I nudged my bedroom door open with the tip of my shoe, half expecting to find someone standing there watching me. But the room was empty. My bed was untouched, the blankets still messy from when I had rolled out of them that morning. I scanned every inch, looking for anything out of place. At first, nothing stood out. Then, I noticed my closet door, normally shut tight, was slightly open. Just enough for someone to slip inside. I swallowed, my fingers tightening around the flashlight. I wasn't about to open that door bare-handed, so I grabbed the end of my hoodie sleeve and used it to pull the handle. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a row of my shirts hanging limply in the dim light. No one was inside. But something was missing. My safe. I kept a small fireproof safe at the bottom of my closet, hidden under a stack of shoeboxes. It wasn't anything high-tech, just a combination lock with some cash, my birth certificate, and a couple of personal documents inside. But now, it was gone. A cold wave of realization hit me. Someone had been here. Someone had taken their time going through my things. My chest tightened as I took a step back, my body screaming at me to get out of the house. But before I could move, something else caught my eye. On the floor, right where the safe should have been, was a single object. A key. One I had never seen before. I crouched down, staring at the key like it was some kind of trap. It was small, old, with a dull brass finish. The kind you'd expect to find in a forgotten drawer or an antique store. My fingers hovered over it for a second before I finally picked it up. It was cold, almost unnaturally so, like it had been sitting outside in the winter air. I turned it over in my hand, looking for any markings, but there was nothing. Just a key, sitting exactly where my safe should have been. My mind raced. Why would someone break in, steal my safe, but leave a key? Was it a message? A mistake? My gut told me this wasn't random. Someone had been inside my house long enough to move things around, long enough for the cigarette smoke to settle. The thought made my skin prickle. I needed to get out of there. My first instinct was to call the cops, but what would I even tell them? Nothing was outright destroyed, and aside from the missing safe, there wasn't much proof of a break-in. The door hadn't been forced open. For all they knew, I could have left it unlocked myself. Still gripping the key, I backed out of my bedroom, my body tense with the urge to run. But as I stepped into the hallway, a sound stopped me cold. A single, deliberate creak from the living room floor. My breath hitched. I hadn't heard it when I came in. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. It was weight. Someone, something, was still here. Every muscle in my body locked up as I turned my head, my eyes darting toward the darkened doorway of the living room. I couldn't see anything past the hallway light, just a void of black stretching into the unlit space beyond. My ears strained, waiting for another sound. A shuffle. A breath. Anything. But there was only silence. The kind that presses in, thick and suffocating. I took a slow step backward, pulse hammering, and then, barely above a whisper, I heard it. A voice. A low, raspy murmur. "You forgot to lock the door again." A sharp, icy chill ran down my spine. The voice was calm, almost amused, like whoever, or whatever, was in my house had been waiting for this moment. My grip on the flashlight tightened until my knuckles ached, my body screaming at me to move, to run, to do something other than just stand there. But I couldn't. My legs felt like concrete. My mind was trying to catch up with what was happening, but nothing made sense. I hadn't imagined it. Someone had spoken. Someone who knew I had left my door unlocked. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the voice was gone. Silence stretched thick around me, but the weight of presence still lingered. I forced myself to take a step back, then another, my breath shallow and quick. I knew I had to get out. My keys were still in my hand, my car just outside. The moment my heel hit the front door threshold, I turned and bolted. I didn't care if I looked crazy. I didn't care if the neighbors saw me running like hell. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and peeled out of my driveway without looking back. I drove aimlessly for over an hour, hands trembling against the wheel. Every time I thought about going back, my mind replayed that voice, those words, and the overwhelming certainty that I had not been alone in that house. Eventually, I pulled into a 24-hour diner and sat there in the parking lot, staring at the key still clutched in my palm. Whoever had broken in had taken my safe, but they hadn't taken anything else. They had left the key. They had spoken to me. And worst of all, they had been inside long enough to know my habits. I never went back to that house alone. The next day, I called a locksmith, had the locks changed, and even installed security cameras. But nothing ever happened again. No signs of forced entry. No more missing items. No more cigarette smoke. Whoever had been there, they had gotten what they wanted. And for some reason, they wanted me to know they had been watching. I still don't know what the key belongs to. I've never used it, but I still have it. And some nights, when I'm alone in my new apartment, I swear I can smell cigarette smoke lingering in the air. I hadn't seen Ethan in years, not since college, but when he invited me over to his new apartment for dinner, I figured, why not? We used to be inseparable back in high school. Late-night drives, dumb inside jokes, all of it. But life happened. He moved to the city for work, and I stayed back in our hometown. So when I was in town for a business trip, it felt like the perfect chance to catch up. His apartment was on the 8th floor of a quiet building, modern but a little impersonal, like he hadn't fully settled in yet. Over dinner, we talked about old times, his new job, my life back home. It felt good, easy, like no time had passed. At some point, as we cleared the table, I asked about the layout of the place. It was a 2-bedroom unit, but Ethan shrugged when I mentioned the extra room. "That one's useless," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "The door's jammed. I don't even go in there." I laughed, assuming he meant it was full of junk, but he shook his head. "No, really. I moved in a few months ago and it was like that from day one. Management never fixed it, so I just ignore it." I joked about kicking it down, but he seemed weirdly uninterested, like he had no curiosity about it at all. I didn't push. By midnight, I was crashing on the couch, too full and a little buzzed from the beers we'd had. Ethan had gone to bed, and the apartment was completely silent, the kind of quiet that presses in on you. I wasn't fully asleep when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't coming from Ethan's room. It was coming from the locked bedroom. I told myself it was just the building settling, maybe pipes knocking. But then it came again. Slow, deliberate, right against the door. I sat up, my skin crawling. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. The tapping stopped. I strained to listen, but the apartment was dead silent again. For a few minutes, I sat there debating whether I should wake Ethan up, but I felt ridiculous. I wasn't a kid afraid of the dark. I laid back down, staring at the ceiling, forcing myself to believe I'd imagined it. Eventually, I must have drifted off, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept thinking about that door, standing there in the dark, something or nothing on the other side. I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Ethan moving around in the kitchen. Sunlight poured in through the blinds, and for a moment, the night before felt like a weird dream. But as I sat up, stretching the stiffness from my limbs, I found myself glancing toward the hallway, toward that locked door. It looked the same as before, plain, unassuming. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing behind it, listening. Ethan raised an eyebrow as I walked into the kitchen. "You look like hell," he said, sliding a mug across the counter. I hesitated before answering, unsure of how to bring it up without sounding crazy. I think I heard something last night." I kept my voice casual, like it wasn't a big deal. "Like tapping, from the locked room." I expected him to roll his eyes, but instead he paused, his grip tightening around his coffee cup. "You probably dreamed it," he said too quickly, looking away. That reaction put me on edge. "Have you ever heard anything from in there?" I asked. He let out a short laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's a locked room, man. There's nothing in there." Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. Before I could press further, Ethan sighed and rubbed his face. "Look, if it'll make you feel better, let's check the security camera." My stomach dropped a little at that. I hadn't realized he had one, but sure enough, he pulled up an app on his phone, scrolling to the footage from last night. The camera was positioned in the hallway, pointed straight at the bedrooms, one door open, leading to Ethan's room, and the other closed. We watched in silence. For a while, there was nothing. Just the dimly lit hallway, the occasional flicker of movement from shadows shifting under the door. Then, at around 3:12 a.m., something changed. The doorknob to the locked room twitched, just slightly at first, like someone testing it. Then it jerked again, harder. I felt my skin prickle. The third time it twisted all the way to the right, as if someone on the other side was trying to open the door. But the door didn't move. It didn't budge an inch. Ethan went pale. He didn't say anything, just stared at the screen, his jaw tight. I could feel my own pulse hammering in my neck. "Dude," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. "What the hell was that?" He swallowed hard and locked his phone, like shutting off the screen would erase what we'd just seen. "I don't know," he muttered. But I could tell he did. Or at least, he had a guess. I wasn't letting it go. "You've lived here for months. You've never checked inside that room?" He hesitated. That tiny, almost imperceptible hesitation. "I told you, the door's jammed," he said, but there was something else in his voice now. Not just annoyance, something closer to fear. "Jammed," I repeated. "But the knob moves." He didn't answer. That silence told me everything. He had heard it before. He had known. I stood up, suddenly needing to put distance between myself and that hallway. "Man, this isn't normal. If someone's been in there—" Ethan cut me off. "No one's in there," he snapped, then ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but I don't mess with that room. I don't need to know, and I sure as hell don't want to open it." That last part sent a shiver down my spine, because it wasn't just reluctance. It was certainty. I should have left right then. Every instinct told me to grab my things and get out of that apartment. But I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the simple fact that Ethan was my friend, and something was seriously wrong here. "Let's just try it," I said. "We checked the door. If it's stuck, fine. But if it opens, don't you want to know what's inside?" Ethan didn't respond at first, but eventually, without looking at me, he nodded. We stood in front of the door, neither of us moving. In the daylight, it looked so ordinary, just a door like any other. But now, knowing what we saw on the footage, it felt different, heavier, like it was holding something back. Ethan exhaled sharply, squared his shoulders, and reached for the knob. I half expected it to be ice cold, but he didn't react. He turned it, testing it. It moved smoothly, but the door didn't open. Ethan frowned and pushed. Nothing. No budging, no rattling, no hint that it was stuck on a hinge. It was like something was pressing back from the other side. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, pushing harder. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. "Kick it," I said. He hesitated, then took a step back and drove his heel into it. A loud thud echoed through the apartment, but the door barely shuddered. "No way," I whispered. Then, as if responding to us, the doorknob twisted, right in front of us. Ethan cursed and stumbled back. My whole body went rigid. The knob turned left, then right. Slow, deliberate movements, like someone was calmly trying to open it. My breath came fast and shallow. I don't know how long we stood there frozen, but then, click. The lock disengaged. The air in the apartment felt charged, electric, like we were standing at the edge of something we weren't meant to see. The door inched open. It only opened about an inch before it stopped. No light spilled out, no glimpse of furniture, no sign of anything inside. Just blackness, a void. My stomach clenched. Something about it felt wrong. Not like a dark room, but like an absence of space itself. A hollow nothing. Ethan didn't move. His breath was coming fast and shallow, his face drained of color. Then slowly the door began to close again. Not slammed, not jerked, just gently pushed shut from the other side. The lock clicked back into place. We didn't say a word. We just turned and walked straight out of the apartment. I don't even remember grabbing my bag. We stood outside in the cold morning air, both of us breathing hard. Ethan lit a cigarette with shaking hands, staring at nothing. Finally, he muttered, "I'm moving out." And I believed him. He broke the lease 2 weeks later. Never went back inside. Never even packed his things. Just left everything behind. He wouldn't talk about it afterward, and honestly, I don't blame him. Because I don't know what we almost let out of that room that day. I was living alone in a high-rise apartment in Chicago when it happened. It was late October, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones even inside. I had moved into the building a few months earlier after a breakup, hoping for a fresh start. My apartment was on the 17th floor, small but cozy, with one bedroom and a balcony that overlooked the city. I worked late shifts at a marketing firm, so I was used to odd sleeping hours, but that night exhaustion knocked me out as soon as my head hit the pillow. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the room was pitch black, and my phone was buzzing loudly on my nightstand. Groggy, I reached for it and saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. I almost ignored it, but something told me to pick up. "Hello?" My voice was thick with sleep. A man's voice, steady but hesitant, responded. "Ms. Thompson? This is Marco from security downstairs. Are you expecting a visitor?" My mind was sluggish, trying to catch up. "No. Why?" A brief pause. "Someone's been standing outside your door for the past 20 minutes. My stomach dropped. My building had strict security. guests needed to check in at the front desk before coming up. I lived alone. No one should be outside my door. I forced myself up, heart pounding, and crept to the front door. The hallway light leaked in through the peephole, casting an eerie glow, but when I pressed my eye against it, nothing. The hallway was empty. My pulse was still hammering in my ears as I whispered, "There's no one there." Marco hesitated again. "Are you sure? The cameras show someone right outside." A chill prickled up my arms. I unlocked the door and cracked it open just an inch, but the hallway was completely still. No footsteps, no movement. Just the hum of the elevator down the hall. "There's no one here," I told him again, firmer this time. "Maybe they left." Feeling uneasy but too tired to dwell on it, I locked the door, double-checked it, and crawled back into bed. I pulled the blankets up to my chin, trying to shake the lingering discomfort. I told myself it was probably a mistake, a glitch in the cameras maybe. But just as I was about to drift off, something made me glance toward my window, and that's when I saw him. A man. Standing on the narrow ledge outside, his face just inches from the glass. I couldn't breathe. My apartment was on the 17th floor. There was no balcony outside my window, just a sheer drop to the street below. And yet, there he was. A man, standing perfectly still on the narrow ledge, staring at me through the glass. His face was pale, almost gray under the faint city lights. And his eyes? They didn't move, didn't blink. He wasn't pressed against the glass, just standing inches away, as if he had all the space in the world. My body locked up, my mind scrambling for an explanation that didn't make sense. Had he climbed up here? How? Why? My first instinct was to bolt for the door, but something kept me frozen in place. I don't know if it was fear or something deeper, but I felt like if I moved too suddenly, he would do something. What? I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. Slowly, I reached for my phone, never taking my eyes off him, and dialed security again. The moment the call connected, I whispered, "Marco, there's someone on my window." My voice was barely there, but I knew he heard the panic in it. "What?" His confusion was instant. "Inside your apartment?" "No," I breathed. "Outside." Silence. Then his voice, urgent now. "Ms. Thompson, your apartment doesn't have a ledge." My stomach turned. I knew that, but it didn't change the fact that there was a man standing there. I could see him clear as day. He hadn't moved an inch. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, a trick of the light, but my gut screamed otherwise. "Stay on the phone," Marco ordered. "I'm sending someone up." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, and slowly, carefully, reached for the blinds. If I couldn't see him, maybe he couldn't see me. Maybe that would break whatever this was. But as soon as I moved, his head tilted. Just slightly. The kind of unnatural, jerky motion that made my stomach churn. Like a puppet on invisible strings. My breath hitched. Then, before I could react, he lifted one hand, palm flat against the glass. I gasped and scrambled backward, nearly dropping my phone. My bedroom was small, but at that moment it felt endless, like I could run forever and still not be far enough from that window. And then, he smiled. Not a wide grin, not exaggerated. Just the faintest, knowing curve of his lips. I wanted to scream, but my throat had locked up. The air in the room felt wrong, heavy, like the pressure had shifted somehow. I kept my phone clenched in my shaking hand, Marco's voice distant in my ear. "Ms. Thompson? Are you there? Talk to me." My mind was racing. Was this a prank? A break-in? But how? My apartment was nearly 200 feet above the ground, and there was no way to reach my window from the outside. My back hit the far wall, and I pressed myself against it, desperate to put as much space as possible between me and him. I had never felt so trapped in my life. The sound of my front door opening jolted me. Security. Relief flooded through me for half a second before I realized something. I hadn't unlocked it. My stomach twisted. "Ms. Thompson?" a voice called from the hallway. "Marco." But I didn't move. I didn't dare take my eyes off the window. "He's right there," I whispered. On the ledge. Footsteps rushed toward my room and I felt Marco's presence before I saw him. He flipped on the light, his expression tense as he followed my gaze. My window was empty, just the glass, reflecting the room back at me. I shook my head violently. "No, he was right there, a man. He touched the glass." I rushed forward, pressing my hands to it, expecting to feel the warmth of where his palm had been. But it was cold, empty. Marco's frown deepened, and he stepped closer, checking the locks. "Nobody could have been out there," he said firmly. "Your window's locked from the inside and there's no ledge. If someone had climbed up, we'd see harness marks or something." His voice was calm, steady, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He didn't believe me. I turned back to the window, my heart still hammering. He had been there. I knew he had. I had seen his face, the way he had smiled. I wasn't crazy. Marco radioed to the other guards, asking if anyone had seen movement outside. Nothing. No alarms triggered, no strange activity. Just me, alone in my locked apartment, staring at an empty window. I wanted to believe it had been a dream, that my exhaustion had played tricks on me. But as Marco started to leave, promising to review the camera footage, I saw it, the faintest smear on the glass. A handprint. But it wasn't on the outside. It was on the inside. I don't remember breathing. My whole body felt like it had turned to ice. I reached out hesitant, tracing my fingers over the smudged outline on the glass. It was faint, but it was there. A human handprint, on the inside. My mind couldn't make sense of it. Had I touched the window earlier without realizing it? No. The shape was too large, the fingers too long. And the worst part? It was right where his palm had been when he pressed against the glass. My stomach churned, nausea rolling through me. I wanted to call Marco back, to make him see it. But a deep, gut-level instinct told me I didn't want to know what his reaction would be. I locked my bedroom door that night, as if that could somehow keep out whatever had happened. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, that slow, deliberate tilt of his head, the knowing smile. By morning, the handprint was gone. I checked the glass over and over, searching for any sign that it had been real, but there was nothing. It was like it had never been there at all. I told myself I had imagined it, that maybe I had been half-dreaming the entire thing. But deep down, I knew better. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I would catch movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing. My reflection in the glass would feel off, like it was just a fraction slower than it should have been. I stopped opening my blinds at night. I stopped looking at my windows at all. But the worst part? The security footage. Marco never found anything. No one at my door, no one in the hallway. And my window? It had been in frame the entire time. The camera should have shown him, but it didn't. I moved out 2 months later. I never told anyone the full story, not even my friends. I don't have an explanation for what happened, and I don't want one. I just know that sometimes, late at night, I still dream of that face. And when I wake up, I don't check the windows anymore. Because some part of me is terrified that one day, he'll be there again. Watching, waiting. And this time, the glass won't be enough to keep him out. I've lived alone for about 3 years now. It's a small house, nothing fancy, just a single-story place with an attic I never use. The kind of house you get when you don't need much. Just a roof over your head and enough space to breathe. I work from home, which means I spend a lot of time here, and I like the quiet. Or at least, I used to. It started on a Thursday night. I was on my couch, half watching some old rerun while scrolling on my phone. It was one of those moments where everything feels still, like the whole world is taking a breath. And then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps above me. Just a few, but enough to make me freeze. The attic. My first thought was a raccoon or maybe a possum. I'd never actually been up there, but I knew there was an old vent that something could have squeezed through. I turned the volume up, convincing myself it wasn't worth checking. A few hours later, I was in bed, lights off, drifting in that space between sleep and wakefulness, when I heard them again. This time, they were faster, pacing, back and forth. My stomach twisted as I listened. No animal moved like that. There was weight to these steps, a rhythm, like someone thinking, hesitating. I held my breath, waiting for them to stop, praying they would. And then, just like before, silence. I exhaled, forcing myself to relax, but the moment I did, a noise cut through the quiet. A soft creak, low and deliberate, coming from the hallway. I knew that sound. The attic hatch. My chest tightened as I turned my head toward the door, half expecting to see something standing there. I told myself the latch was loose, that maybe the wind had nudged it open. But deep down, I knew better. I didn't move right away. I just lay there, staring at the dark hallway through the open bedroom door, waiting for something to happen. My ears strained for any sound, a breath, a shift in weight, anything. But there was nothing. Just silence stretching longer than it should have. Finally, I sat up, my heart pounding in my throat. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it toward the hallway. The attic hatch was open. Not all the way, just enough to see that it had been pushed down. The wooden frame hung there still, as if whoever had moved it was waiting for me to react. I told myself it could have been a draft. Maybe the latch hadn't caught properly. But then I noticed something else. Dust. A fine layer covered the wooden lip of the opening, except for one spot. A smudged, clean mark, like something had been gripping the edge. That was enough. I grabbed the metal baseball bat I kept under my bed and forced myself to walk toward the attic entrance. My pulse was hammering in my ears. I took a deep breath and, in one quick motion, shoved the hatch closed. The latch clicked back into place, sealing whatever was up there inside. My hands were shaking as I stepped back, my body screaming at me to run. But where? This was my house, and I wasn't about to leave because of a noise. I spent the next hour sitting on my couch, the bat still in my lap, phone in my other hand. I debated calling the police, but what would I even say? Hey, I think someone's in my attic, but I haven't actually seen them? I knew how that would go. They'd check, find nothing, and I'd be left looking paranoid. So instead, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for whatever was up there to make another move. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off on the couch because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a sound. A single, sharp thud from above. My eyes snapped open, and for a moment I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. Then, another, louder, like something, or someone, was shifting their weight directly above me. I gripped the bat, my fingers slick with sweat. My first instinct was to run outside, but the thought of stepping into the darkness alone was somehow worse. Instead, I grabbed my phone and finally did what I should have done hours ago. I dialed 911. The moment the dispatcher answered, I felt ridiculous. "I think someone's in my attic," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. I expected her to dismiss me, but she took it seriously. Said an officer would be there in 10 minutes. I didn't want to wait. I needed to know. Keeping my phone in one hand, I walked slowly toward the hallway, stopping right beneath the attic hatch. It was still closed, but something was different now. The air felt heavier, like the house itself was holding its breath. I raised the phone's flashlight, angling it toward the ceiling. That's when I saw it. A crack. Small, barely noticeable, running along the edge of the attic hatch. It hadn't been there before. As I stared, something moved behind it. A shadow shifting, pressing lightly against the wood. My stomach dropped. There was something up there, and it knew I was standing beneath it. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. The crack in the attic hatch widened just slightly, as if something on the other side was testing it, pressing against it with careful, deliberate pressure. Then, all at once, it stopped. The shadow shifted away. Silence. The kind that's worse than any noise because it means something is waiting. The distant wail of a siren snapped me out of my paralysis. The cops were almost here. I gripped the bat tighter, keeping my eyes locked on the attic hatch, half expecting it to burst open before they arrived. But nothing happened. No more noises, no more movement. Just stillness. When the officers finally knocked on my door, I practically ran to let them in. They checked everything. The attic hatch, the attic itself, even the outside of the house. Nothing. No footprints in the dust, no sign of forced entry. One of the cops, Officer Reynolds, an older guy with tired eyes, gave me a long look and asked if I'd been under a lot of stress lately. I knew what he meant. He thought I imagined it. But I didn't. I know what I heard. I saw something move up there. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my locked bedroom with the bat across my lap, waiting for something to happen. But it didn't. And it hasn't since. The attic hatch has stayed closed. No more footsteps. No more movement. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is too quiet, I swear I can feel something up there, waiting, watching. And I know deep down that one night it's going to make a noise again. I moved into the apartment 2 weeks ago. It was a small, one-bedroom unit in an older building on the edge of town, the kind of place that still had creaky wooden floors and water-stained ceilings. It wasn't perfect, but it was within my budget. And after a recent breakup, I needed a fresh start. My days were quiet. I worked from home as a freelance editor, which meant I spent a lot of time alone. The building itself was mostly silent too, except for the occasional footsteps from the hallway or the hum of the neighbor's TV late at night. That's why, when I first started hearing the whispers, I assumed I was imagining things. It started around midnight on my third night there. I was in bed, half asleep, when I noticed a faint murmuring coming from the wall behind my headboard. At first I thought it was just the pipes, or maybe the wind slipping through a crack somewhere. But the more I listened, the more certain I became that it was voices, soft, hushed, almost rhythmic. I couldn't make out the words, but they were definitely speaking in a language I didn't recognize. I told myself it was just my neighbor on the phone, maybe watching a foreign movie. But the sound was oddly constant. Not a normal conversation with pauses or inflections. Just an endless, steady stream of whispering. By the end of the first week, the whispering had become part of my nightly routine. It never happened during the day, only after midnight, always coming from the same spot in the wall. I started paying more attention, trying to catch patterns in the words, but they never made sense. It wasn't any language I had ever heard. Sometimes I could swear I heard multiple voices overlapping, whispering over each other, like a chorus of secrets just out of reach. The thought of it made my skin crawl, but I didn't feel threatened. Not yet. If anything, I was just curious. One night I decided to get closer. I turned off my bedroom lights and sat on the floor, pressing my ear against the wall. The whispering was clearer now, but still indecipherable. My heart pounded a little harder, but I wasn't scared, just intrigued. I closed my eyes, straining to make out even a single recognizable word. And then, it stopped. Abruptly. Completely. The silence was so immediate, so unnatural, that a chill ran down my spine. I held my breath, waiting. And then, from just beyond the drywall, a voice whispered my name. I shot away from the wall so fast that I nearly knocked over the lamp beside me. My skin was ice cold, my heartbeat a frantic hammering in my chest. I sat there on the floor, staring at the wall, waiting, praying that I had imagined it. But I hadn't. The voice had been right there, inches away, muffled but unmistakable. And it had said my name. Not a random sound, not a generic whisper. My actual name clear as day. I didn't even want to breathe too loudly, afraid that whatever was on the other side was still listening. For the rest of the night, I kept every light in the apartment on. I tried rationalizing it. Maybe I had dozed off and dreamed it. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation. Maybe my neighbor had somehow learned my name. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The voice had sounded too close. Too intentional. And when I checked my lease agreement the next morning, I felt my stomach drop. According to the documents, the unit next to mine was vacant. No one had lived there for months. I considered calling the landlord, but what would I even say? That I was hearing voices through the wall? That someone had whispered my name from an empty apartment? They'd probably tell me it was a plumbing issue or some weird acoustics in the old building. And honestly, I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I had just moved in. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I tried to push it out of my mind. For the next few nights, I slept with earbuds in, blasting white noise to drown out any sounds from the walls. It worked, for a while. But a few nights later, I woke up in the dark with the unmistakable feeling that someone was watching me. My apartment was still. The only sound was the quiet hum of the fridge from the kitchen. But the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. And then, from the darkness, just behind my bed, I heard it again. A whisper. Not from the wall this time, closer, right beside me. I didn't move. I couldn't. My whole body locked up, frozen between fight and flight. The whisper was so close, I could almost feel the breath of it against my skin. It didn't say my name this time. It didn't say anything I could understand. Just that same low, rhythmic murmuring I had heard through the wall. Except now, it was right in my room. My mouth went dry. I forced myself to turn my head, inch by inch, toward the sound. But there was nothing there. Just darkness. Just empty space. I reached for my bedside lamp with a shaking hand and flicked it on. The whispering stopped immediately. My bedroom looked the same as always, but everything felt wrong, like the walls were pressing in just a little too close. My skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My body screamed at me to run, to get out, to leave everything behind and never look back. But I didn't. Instead, I did the one thing that, looking back, I regret the most. I spoke. "Who's there?" My voice came out small, hoarse. The silence that followed was absolute. I held my breath, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, movement, another whisper. And then, just as I was about to convince myself I had imagined it all, there was a sound. A slow, deliberate scratching against the wall, right where I had pressed my ear a few nights before. The sound slithered through the air like nails dragging against drywall. My stomach twisted. That wasn't a rat. That wasn't the pipes. Someone, something, was letting me know it was still there. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By sunrise, I had already called the landlord, made up some excuse about a job offer in another city, and broken my lease. I packed in record time and left that apartment behind without looking back. To this day, I don't know what was in that unit, whispering through the walls. I don't want to know, but sometimes when it's late at night and I'm lying in bed, I swear I can still hear it, just at the edge of hearing. A faint, rhythmic whisper, like it's still looking for me.